In the last hour, a new flashpoint has emerged in U.S.-Canada relations, and it centers on the Great Lakes, one of the most strategically important shipping corridors in the world. According to confirmed reports, Donald Trump has publicly demanded a massive new shipping arrangement tied to the Great Lakes, attaching a price tag of $650 billion and framing it as a condition for future trade cooperation. The demand itself was striking. What happened next is why this story exploded. Within hours, Canadian officials issued a response that was blunt, unapologetic, and unusually direct. That response has now gone viral, not because of inflammatory language, but because of how clearly it rejected the premise of the demand altogether. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the Great Lakes represent. They are not just bodies of water. They are a shared economic artery governed by decades of treaties, international law, and binational agreements that regulate navigation, environmental protection, and commercial access. No single country controls them outright, and no leader can unilaterally impose terms without renegotiating foundational agreements. Trump's demand, as described by multiple outlets, framed the Great Lakes shipping corridor as a leverage point. The argument presented was that the United States shoulders disproportionate infrastructure and security costs and therefore should receive a massive financial concession in exchange for continued access under favorable terms. The figure cited $650 billion immediately raised eyebrows among trade experts and diplomats. From a diplomatic standpoint, the size of the number was as important as the demand itself. It signaled not a negotiating position in the traditional sense, but a pressure tactic designed to dominate headlines and force a reaction. And Canada did react. The Canadian response did not engage in back-and-forth bargaining. Instead, officials emphasized that the Great Lakes are governed by binding international agreements that cannot be altered through unilateral demands or public pressure. One senior Canadian official summarized the position succinctly, stating that the lakes are shared, managed by law, and not subject to purchase, ransom, or political theatrics. That statement spread rapidly online, not because it was dramatic, but because of its tone, calm, firm, and dismissive of the demand's legitimacy. In diplomatic circles, that kind of response sends a message not just to the other country, but to allies, markets, and international institutions watching closely. What makes this exchange particularly sensitive is timing. Global trade routes are already under strain. Shipping disruptions, geopolitical tensions, and economic uncertainty have made waterways like the Great Lakes more valuable, not less. Any suggestion that access could become politicized immediately triggers concern well beyond the two countries involved. For Trump, the demand fits a familiar pattern: high-stakes economic leverage, public framing, and maximalist positions designed to reset negotiations on his terms. Supporters view it as aggressive deal-making. Critics view it as destabilizing brinkmanship. But in this case, the counterparty is not a private firm or a smaller trading partner. It is a sovereign nation with equal legal standing over a shared resource. Canada's viral response reflects that reality. By grounding its reply in treaties and international law, Canada signaled that this is not a matter for negotiation in the way Trump framed it. That framing difference is critical. One side treats the issue as a transaction, the other treats it as settled law. Markets noticed, shipping analysts noted, and so did policymakers on both sides of the border. When disputes involve waterways governed by long-standing agreements, escalation does not stay bilateral for long. It draws in international bodies, legal review, and diplomatic pressure from allies who rely on predictable trade rules. Another layer to this story is domestic politics. Trump's demand plays well to a narrative of economic nationalism and hard bargaining. Canada's response plays well to a narrative of sovereignty and rule-based order. Both messages resonate with their respective audiences, but they also lock both sides into positions that are difficult to soften without appearing to retreat. That is why this exchange escalated so quickly online. The Canadian reply went viral not because it insulted Trump, but because it refused to engage on his terms at all. In diplomatic language, that is often more cutting than any rhetorical jab. It is also worth noting what has not happened. There has been no formal notice to withdraw from existing Great Lakes agreements. There has been no legal filing. There has been no bilateral summit announced. This remains for now a public confrontation rather than a procedural one. But public confrontations have a way of forcing procedural follow-up, especially when they gain traction. Trade experts caution that even floating such demands can introduce uncertainty. Shipping contracts, insurance rates, and long-term infrastructure planning depend on stability. When leaders suggest that access to shared routes could be monetized or renegotiated unilaterally, It sends ripples through those systems. Canada's decision to respond quickly and clearly appears aimed at containing that uncertainty. By reaffirming the legal framework, officials sought to reassure partners and markets that nothing fundamental has changed, regardless of political rhetoric. As this story develops, the key question is not whether a $650 billion deal will happen. It will not, under current law. The real question is whether this exchange hardens into a broader trade confrontation or dissipates after the initial shock. In the next part, we will examine what legal and economic constraints actually govern the Great Lakes, why unilateral demands are so difficult to enforce, and how similar confrontations have played out historically between close allies. For now, what is clear is this: a dramatic demand was made, a firm response was issued, and the world is watching to see whether this moment becomes another negotiating spectacle or the opening of a much deeper rift. To understand why Canada's response was so swift and unequivocal, you have to look at the legal architecture that governs the Great Lakes. These waterways are not managed by handshake deals or political mood. They are governed by a dense web of treaties, binational commissions, and regulatory frameworks that have been built up over more than a century. At the center of this structure is the principle that the Great Lakes are shared waters. Navigation rights, shipping access, environmental protection, and infrastructure responsibilities are jointly managed. Neither country can unilaterally impose fees, conditions, or access restrictions without violating binding agreements that have survived wars, economic crises, and major political shifts. That is why trade lawyers immediately dismissed the $650 billion figure as legally unenforceable. There is no mechanism under existing law for one country to demand payment for access to a shared waterway in the way Trump described. Any attempt to do so would trigger immediate legal challenges, diplomatic retaliation, and likely intervention by international arbitration bodies. Canada's reply was crafted with this in mind. By invoking law rather than emotion, officials effectively removed the issue from the realm of deal-making and placed it back where they believe it belongs, inside established legal process. That move matters because it reframes the conversation. It tells allies and markets that Canada is not interested in theatrical escalation, but it is also not willing to renegotiate foundational rules under pressure. There is also an economic reality behind the response. The Great Lakes shipping system benefits both countries enormously. Ports, manufacturing hubs, agriculture, and energy supply chains on both sides of the border depend on predictable access. Disrupting that system would impose massive costs on American industries as well as Canadian ones. Shipping experts pointed out that any attempt to extract a fee of this magnitude would immediately raise transportation costs across the Midwest and Ontario, hitting U.S. exporters just as hard as Canadian firms. That is another reason Canada's response focused on stability. The message was not just political, it was economic. Trump's framing of the issue reflects a broader pattern in his approach to trade. He often treats international arrangements as imbalanced deals that can be reopened through pressure. That strategy has sometimes produced concessions in bilateral negotiations, particularly where one side has more leverage. But in this case, leverage is constrained by law. That constraint is what makes this exchange so instructive. It highlights the limits of transactional politics when it collides with institutionalized cooperation. The Great Lakes are not a tariff line or a discretionary trade preference. They are a shared system embedded in international law. Canada's viral response resonated because it articulated that reality clearly. By rejecting the premise rather than the price, Canadian officials avoided getting drawn into a debate over numbers. They denied the legitimacy of the demand itself. In diplomatic terms, that is a powerful move. International reaction has been muted but telling. Other U.S. allies have not rushed to comment publicly, but trade analysts note that they are watching closely. If the United States were seen as willing to challenge long-standing shared resource agreements, it would raise questions about other cooperative frameworks around the world. That concern extends beyond waterways. It touches on how global infrastructure is governed. Shipping lanes, airspace, energy grids, and digital networks all rely on predictable rules. Any signal that those rules could be upended by political demand creates uncertainty far beyond the immediate dispute. Domestically, the exchange also plays into competing narratives. Trump's supporters see the demand as standing up for American interests and challenging what they view as unfair arrangements. Canada's response reinforces its own domestic narrative of defending sovereignty and the rule of law against external pressure. Both sides are speaking to their bases as much as to each other. That dynamic makes de-escalation harder. Once positions are publicly staked and go viral, backing down carries political cost. Leaders become constrained not just by law, but by perception. That is often how rhetorical confrontations harden into prolonged disputes, even when legal resolution is clear. However, there is an important difference between rhetoric and action. So far, no formal steps have been taken to alter Great Lakes governance. No notices have been filed. No treaties have been challenged in court. This remains, at least for now, a battle of statements rather than institutions. Canada's strategy appears aimed at keeping it that way. By responding quickly and firmly, officials may be hoping to shut down speculation before it forces procedural escalation. The goal is to reassure partners that the existing framework remains intact regardless of political noise. Whether that strategy succeeds depends largely on what happens next. If the demand is repeated, formalized, or tied to other trade measures, the dispute could move into legal and diplomatic channels. If it fades, this episode may be remembered as another flashpoint that generated headlines but not lasting change. In the final part, we will look at what realistic next steps could unfold from here, how similar confrontations between close allies have resolved in the past, and why the reaction to this demand may matter more than the demand itself. For now, the takeaway is clear. The Great Lakes are governed by law, not leverage. Canada's response made that point unmistakably, and the limits of transactional politics have rarely been illustrated so starkly. As this story develops, the key question is not whether a $650 billion deal will happen. It will not, under current law. The real question is whether this exchange hardens into a broader trade confrontation or dissipates after the initial shock. In the next part, we will examine what legal and economic constraints actually govern the Great Lakes, why unilateral demands are so difficult to enforce, and how similar confrontations have played out historically between close allies. For now, what is clear is this: a dramatic demand was made, a firm response was issued, and the world is watching to see whether this moment becomes another negotiating spectacle or the opening of a much deeper rift. As this episode continues to unfold, the most important question is not whether a $650 billion Great Lakes shipping deal will materialize. Under existing law, it will not. The more meaningful question is what this confrontation reveals about how disputes between close allies are evolving and how quickly rhetoric can test the boundaries of long-standing cooperation. Historically, disagreements between the United States and Canada over shared resources have followed a predictable pattern. Initial political posturing is often followed by quieter engagement through legal and diplomatic channels. Even during periods of heightened tension, both countries have generally returned to established frameworks rather than attempting to dismantle them. The durability of those frameworks is precisely why the Great Lakes system has remained stable for generations. What makes this moment stand out is the public nature of the demand and the equally public refusal. In earlier disputes, leaders tended to signal concerns privately before escalating. Here, the demand itself was made in a way that ensured immediate visibility, and Canada's response was crafted to be equally visible. That mutual publicity raises the stakes, not legally, but politically. For Canada, the calculation appears straightforward. By drawing a firm line and grounding its response in law, officials signaled that there is no negotiating space on the core issue. That approach reduces uncertainty and reassures partners that existing agreements remain intact. It also avoids setting a precedent in which shared resources can be treated as bargaining chips. For the United States, the implications are more complex. Even if the demand is not pursued formally, the episode introduces questions about predictability. Allies value stability not because they oppose hard bargaining, but because shared systems require trust to function. When trust is shaken, even temporarily, it can affect investment decisions, infrastructure planning, and diplomatic relationships. Trade analysts emphasize that uncertainty is often more damaging than conflict itself. Markets can adapt to clear rules, even unfavorable ones. What they struggle with is ambiguity. By responding decisively, Canada attempted to remove ambiguity from the equation. Whether that effort succeeds depends on whether the rhetoric escalates or subsides. There is also a lesson here about the limits of leverage. Not all assets can be monetized through pressure. Some are embedded in legal regimes precisely to prevent that. The Great Lakes are one such asset. Their governance reflects decades of recognition that shared resources require shared stewardship, not transactional control. This episode also illustrates how quickly international issues can become domestic political symbols. In the United States, the demand reinforces narratives about economic sovereignty and tough negotiating tactics. In Canada, the response reinforces narratives about defending national interests and the rule of law. Once those narratives take hold, they can be difficult to unwind, even when practical resolution is straightforward. Looking ahead, there are several realistic paths this situation could take. One is de-escalation, where the demand fades from public discussion and both sides return to routine cooperation. That outcome is consistent with past experience and remains the most likely if no formal steps follow. Another path involves procedural escalation, where the issue is raised in formal trade talks or linked to other negotiations. That would bring lawyers, diplomats, and potentially international bodies into play. Even then, existing agreements would heavily constrain outcomes, but the process itself could be disruptive. A third possibility is symbolic repetition without substantive action. The demand could continue to be referenced rhetorically without triggering legal changes. That scenario would prolong uncertainty but stop short of institutional conflict. What is unlikely is a fundamental rewrite of Great Lakes governance driven by unilateral demand. The legal, economic, and diplomatic barriers are simply too high. Both countries have too much at stake in maintaining the system as it exists. The broader takeaway is about how global cooperation is tested in an era of heightened rhetoric. Shared systems, whether waterways, trade corridors, or security arrangements, depend on restraint as much as enforcement. When leaders test those systems publicly, the responses matter as much as the provocations. Canada's response went viral not because it was aggressive, but because it was definitive. It closed the door rather than arguing over price. That clarity is often what stabilizes volatile moments, even if it does not generate headlines as dramatic as the initial demand. As observers, it is important to separate noise from consequence. The noise in this case was loud. The consequence so far has been containment rather than escalation. That distinction is crucial. Whether this episode becomes a footnote or a turning point will depend on what follows. Institutions tend to outlast rhetoric, but they require consistent reinforcement. For now, the legal framework governing the Great Lakes remains intact, trade continues, and cooperation persists beneath the surface. This moment serves as a reminder that not every demand reshapes reality, and not every viral exchange signals rupture. Sometimes the most telling outcome is that established rules hold, even under pressure. We will continue to monitor developments closely, focusing on confirmed actions rather than speculation. As with many international disputes, the story's significance lies less in the headline and more in what quietly endures after the attention moves on. For now, the takeaway is clear. The Great Lakes are governed by law, not leverage. Canada's response made that point unmistakably. And the limits of transactional politics have rarely been illustrated so starkly. As this story develops, the key question is not whether a $650 billion deal will happen. It will not under current law. The real question is whether this exchange hardens into a broader trade confrontation or dissipates after the initial shock. In the next part, we will examine what legal and economic constraints actually govern the Great Lakes, why unilateral demands are so difficult to enforce, and how similar confrontations have played out historically between close allies. For now, what is clear is this: a dramatic demand was made, a firm response was issued, and the world is watching to see whether this moment becomes another negotiating spectacle or the opening of a much deeper rift.